you very much again for the opportunity. We started this conversation many months ago, straight after our offices were raided both in Sydney and Melbourne. It's been a sort of long time in the making, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity and obviously thank Mark for coming along as well. For those of you who don't know, the Australian Workers' Union has been operating for around about 131 years, nearly 132 years now. Our organisation was the target of raids by the Australian Federal Police towards the back end of last year as a consequence of the now Registered Organisations Commission investigating us over our donations made to an organisation which most of you probably know as Get Up. What is probably the unknown story behind that is at around 2006 and before that, around 2004, 2005, there was an organisation that was set up in the United States called Move On, which was the precursor to Get Up set up in Australia. Our organisation had met with Move On. We had them come along to a number of our executive meetings, and we were considering whether or not a similar organisation would have some place in Australian politics, in the Australian community, as an organisation for progressive change and an organisation that could take on a range of different issues. We decided after some deliberation that we would get involved in what was the eventual setup of Get Up, as it's now known. At the time, our then National Secretary, Bill Shorten, was also, in the early stages, was the Secretary of our Victorian branch as well and held dual roles, and was involved in some of those conversations. And as he saw it, going forward, that people were going to be more interested in focusing on particular issues as they arose, instead of just focus on everyone getting in mass movement about every single issue. And he saw both Move On and Get Up as a potential vehicle to be able to solve that. So our organisation was one of a number who decided to give a bunch of seed funding to what was then known as Get Up. And our organisation donated $100,000 to them to get set up in around 2005, 2006. As a consequence of that, we fast forward some 11, nearly 12 years later, and we were in our lawyers' offices in Victoria when we were notified that the Australian Federal Police were about to turn up out the front and to raid our offices both in Melbourne and in Sydney. And for most of you, that probably sounds a little bit strange that we were called in advance to say that that was taking place. It was even more so odd to us was the fact that we had a range of media already set up out the front of both Sydney and Melbourne, and it was in fact the media who gave us the notification when we asked, well, why are you all set up out the front of our offices, was because the AFP are about to come and raid. So we, at the time, have set in place a number of steps to deal with that. But I think it's probably just important to really set a bit of a background in terms of what the issue is at hand. So the federal government, after the Trade Union Royal Commission, has been going through to try and find anything they possibly can to destroy the credibility of our organisation as a consequence of Bill Shorten now being the opposition leader, but having held a role with the AWU is a link to try and succeed through. We have looked after many industries across the country. We're one of the broadest trade unions in the country, and unfortunately, as a consequence of Bill having come through, we know that we are a much bigger target than a lot of others. So what happened was the Trade Union Royal Commission came and gone and didn't actually achieve anything, and so as part of that, the government continued to work with the what we believe is the Australian newspaper to try and flush out additional stories to try and smear the credibility of our organisation and smear the credibility of anyone else involved. And so hence began the story of the Get Up donation. So I was overseas at the time when I remember getting a phone call from the journalist Brad Norrington, who said that he's investigating some donations that were made to Get Up and wanted us to supply all relevant materials in relation to the donation in terms of the approvals that took place from our executives through the authorities that were signed off to the AEC. We responded that we didn't believe that the Australian newspaper was a regulatory body in which we need to respond to, and so therefore, thanks very much for your request, but we'll just leave it there. We ended up having six front pages in a row, basically talking about the donations, and the same story rehash over and over and over. So what happened after that was the federal government then said, oh, well, because the media are talking about it, there's a public interest test here, and so the Registered Organisations Commission should then have a look into the organisation. And so just remember that we're in 2017, that the donations were made in 2006. So some 11 years on, they're saying we need to go back and have a look at these donations. So they started, the Registered Organisations Commission said to us, so is there anything you'd like to say or shed any light on this? So through our lawyers, we politely responded and just said, you've got to be kidding. No, like if you're going to formally proceed with this, then yes, sure, we'll have a look at it, but on the basis that the Australian has written a few articles about it, we're not going to do anything else. What ended up happening was the Registered Organisations Commission then formally wrote to us and said they're going to commence an investigation. And so we got a meeting together of all of our sort of lawyers to really plan out our strategy on how we're going to respond. It was at that time, fortunately, you know, if you're ever going to think about who you want to be meeting with at a time a significant event like this was going to happen, we were meeting with them at the time when we ended up finding out that we're getting raided. So we had federal police turn up to both our Sydney and Melbourne offices. At the time, we counted between the two, there were around 38 people that turned up to our two offices. The preceding day, the Commissioner for the Australian Federal Police said, because of the lack of resources available to the Australian Federal Police, they're unable to investigate cocaine rings, pedophile rings, and I think it was terrorism. There was one other one, it was a third one they were unable to investigate. But however, they managed to find a whole bunch of staff, a whole lot of officers to be able to make sure they were freed up to be able to come in and raid our organisation. So we were obviously a bit, put out by that. I think we've gone through a lot. We've gone through investigations, criminal investigations, royal commissions. We've gone through recessions and wartime and everything else, and the organisation still stands 131 years on. But I think this is probably one of the first times that we've been raided by the Australian Federal Police. So what unfolded was they sort of burst into our office. They went to execute a whole lot of warrants, and they said that we're here to seize a whole lot of documents. We had all of our staff at work at the time because this was late in the afternoon, obviously getting ready for primetime TV to hit at 6 o'clock. And so they obviously asked us, the staff were asking, well, what do we do? What should we do? And so we obviously fully complied with everything that was requested of us and assisted the Federal Police through that investigation. All in all, and this will eventually come to light, but all in all, all the resources that were pumped into doing that raid, there's really 4 pieces of paper which are relevant to this. We had folders and other bits and pieces that had all been taken, but it was at that point in time that our organisation made a stand to say that what had been done, we accepted that we were going to be hit and targeted as part of Bill Shorten being a part of our union in the past, but that this was such a significant overreach. And so we immediately commenced some proceedings, and ever since that day, every single document that's been taken out of our office remains sealed and has not been viewed by a single person. And we have set on course a very, very, very expensive set of legal proceedings to eventually, hopefully, find out who was behind the original go-ahead to start this investigation. So what we now know through discovery is that there were an advisor in the Minister's office at the time who became aware that we were about to be raided, who tipped off media. He's since left. We had significant intel, but weren't able to progress it too much further, that there were potentially her chief of staff was involved. Over Christmas break, her chief of staff was gone. We had evidence to support that someone from the Fair Work Ombudsman had also had knowledge of it. They've since left that organisation. The Minister, who was the Minister for Workplace Relations, has since been switched out of her portfolio and now looks after a different area as a consequence of that. So some of you might say that's kind of clearing the decks for what might be some bad news coming forward. The AFP then commenced an investigation into the AFP leaks, which I find is quite ironic. But they are looking into how did it come about that people knew that the AFP were turning up to an investigation, and so they are having a look into that as well. So we had asked for all documents from the Minister's Office. We asked for every document from the Registered Organisations Commission. We asked for every document from the Fair Work Ombudsman. We asked for a whole lot of information from the AFP, all of which to help us form a view to say whether or not people misuse powers to commence this investigation into the organisation. The AFP have said that there's a bunch of documents that, because there's now a criminal investigation on foot, i.e. someone leaked something to take away from the course of action, sort of preventing the investigation raid properly following suit, that they claim privilege over a whole lot of documents. About 3 weeks ago, those documents were confidentially shown to a federal court judge because we can't get access to them as yet. And they've basically given extension to our case. So they prolonged our case because they believe that material is significant for us to be able to have a case with all the relevant information available to us. So as far as things stand, we've been going on for many, many months. It's cost us a huge amount of money, and unfortunately it's a very big distraction away from the core business, which is trying to represent our members' interests. But I'm sure most of you will agree some of the scenes that you saw on TV unfolding over those days as piles and piles of police running into our offices is probably one of the greatest overreaches that I've ever seen, at least in my time, and misuse of police resources to attack your political enemies. And so we've had a huge amount of support, both from the trade union movement, from the broader community movement, from business community, who have said to us that what they saw was completely and utterly ridiculous. And so we are still standing strong. Our legal case is now not going to be heard until August when we're in front of the federal court. But based on the information that we've seen, based on what we believe the AFP have got, not only do we think that there's likely to be a criminal charge against someone who was involved in leaking this information out, we also think that there's sufficient grounds to prove that this investigation was improperly constructed and those warrants poorly executed as well. So it's been a very, very difficult time for us, no doubt. But I think it's just a good opportunity for us to be able to share our stories at events like this, so people have a full understanding of the facts. And like I said, keep in mind at the end of the day, with all the sort of hoo-ha around it and everything that took place, there's 4 pieces of paper which are relevant to this investigation, which will eventually be showed to everyone, regardless of the outcome of the case. So I'll just leave it as that. Thanks very much.